Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LCK week number 1 overview and analysis video. It's time to get into it. The LCK has officially started here in the summer split, and we're going to be reviewing every single game of every series like we typically do on this channel, starting, of course, with week number 1. If you haven't checked out my primer video on the LCK, that's going to be linked up in the iCard right now. I highly recommend you check that out before watching this video. I give my thoughts on every single one of these teams. I power rank them from number 10 to number 1. I rank all of the players. I give them grades. I talk about where I think teams could land as a floor and as a ceiling. You know, I really go into depth on these teams about as much as you're going to see on the internet, and so I really would appreciate it if you check that out. It's going to be a lot of useful information if you're interested in the LCK, but today we're going to be going over everything that happened in week number 1 in particular, all 10 series across all 5 days. So if you are excited, let me know down in the comments section below what teams over or underperformed your expectations. Would love to know who you are impressed or not impressed by, what players really over or underperformed your expectations. Just give me all your thoughts on everything going on in the LCK down in the comment section below, whatever you want to talk about. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. I don't want to waste too much of you guys' time. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series that we talk about, and at the end of the week, I will tie everything up into a nice, neat little bow with a player of the week and a dud of the week. And then, of course, we will also be updating my personal power rankings from number 10 to number 1. There will be some shakeups this week. There were some interesting results in the LCK. I can spoil that at the beginning. Certainly not the kind of cookie-cutter results that we got in the spring split. This looks like it's going to be a lot more dynamic, which I think a lot of people are really excited about. So, without further ado, let's jump into the analysis, and that means starting with day number 1. And kicking off our LCK summer split, it was a matchup between Hanwha Life Esports and Dplus KIA that, shockingly, Dplus KIA is actually going to be able to take. This team did really well in their playoff run. Certainly, at least from my perspective, they did better than anticipated. Not that I didn't believe that they could beat KT Rolster. I thought that that was pretty realistic, but they actually played really well against Gen.G. A lot of progression down the stretch. I think a lot of their less experienced players were really good in their playoff run. My concern with this team going into summer, and the reason I had them at number 5 in my power rankings instead of number 4, is I just didn't know if that was going to be a continuous trend for them, if they were going to be able to keep that up throughout an entire split, because we did see some problems with this team in the regular season. There was a reason they were 500, but it's a pretty good first look from them. I definitely have to say that. HLE did not come out expecting to lose this. They were favorites pretty heavily in this. We've kind of been calling the LCK a top 3 kind of league for a little bit. The top 3 teams just felt so much more consistent than everybody else, but HLE definitely not coming out hot at the start. Player of the series for me is going to go to Showmaker in the mid lane. He was excellent here. He truly was great in both of their wins. I mean, he decimated game number 1. Game 1 was not even remotely close. His Taliyah was everywhere on the map. It was so hard to play against that it became impossible for HLE to do anything in the mid game. This is the problem with Taliyah when she starts getting out of control. We, I guess, see this a lot in a lot of the other regions. We've seen Taliyah, you know, absolutely dominate. We've seen the consistency that that champion offers. There was a reason I was calling her the best champ in the game for the majority of the spring split. I still think a lot of those positives end up being the case now. It's just a little bit of a different meta in terms of the jungle, and so she's not quite as synergistic with a lot of the meta junglers as she was in the spring split, but Taliyah can still absolutely wreck a game, and it's not like Vi's gotten any worse. Lucid was really good this series. The Nidalee is going to stand out for a lot of people in game number 3 because he hard carried that third and final game. Basically solo won it for DK. I'm not going to say solo won it because Showmaker was still really good on Tristana. I really liked how aiming played throughout a majority of game number 3 as well on the Zeri. I think a lot of people are going to look at some of Kellen's plays and be like, but I mean, it's Kellen. Like, we got what we expected from Kellen, which is that sometimes early in the game, he's going to make some decisions that put his team in a really weird spot that aren't necessarily the most cohesive decisions. He made a lot of those in the spring split, but just like he did in the spring split and just like he has in previous years, when it matters the most in these 5v5 team fights, he's going to be one of the most dangerous supports in the world. He lands one crucial engage here on Nautilus and the game just instantly ends. I mean, Kellen was a big reason why DK was able to win that game, even if he was also the reason why that game was even in flux in the first place. So kind of a funny little dichotomy there when it comes to Kellen. I've always liked him as a player more than your average analyst. Anybody who's followed the channel will know that. And, you know, I think for the most part, as long as you're able to make up for your bad plays, I can live with the bad plays, and Kellen, for the most part, does that. But Showmaker and Lucid were definitely the carries, in my opinion, here for DK. Kingen was fine. Aiming was fine. I really want to see if Showmaker can keep this up. If he can, it's going to be very dangerous for the rest of the league, because Showmaker, you know, at his best, is a guy who can carry a team to top 3. Like, can easily be the best player on a top 3 team. He's not even in his prime anymore, but he still is at that level, and Lucid showed a lot of development here in this series. If he can actually show up and be like a borderline top 3, top 4 jungle, which I think is possible considering his skill set, I think that's going to be huge for this team because he was one of the liabilities, quote unquote, in the regular season last split, who did level up a lot in the playoffs. He was really good in their playoff run. If he keeps that form like he did in this series, it's going to be dangerous. This jungle mid could be a problem. And then for HLE on the other side, again, really not how you wanted to start this split. Basically the opposite of how you wanted to start this split. Everything kind of went wrong in this series. People are going to look at jungle support, and I kind of agree. Peanut's going to get dud of the series for me. I just do not believe that Kha'Zix was the right choice in really any circumstance in this series. I get that you have the Skarner for engage. You don't feel like you need to go something a little bit safer in the jungle. You feel like you can capitalize on maybe, you know, the Skarner plus the Alistar and Rel and just kind of be a big damage threat coming out of the jungle, and that kind of worked in game number 2, but game 3 it failed so hard and you really didn't establish any sort of consistency that it became a real issue. The Kha'Zix was so useless towards the back half of this series, and that was a big reason why HLE lost. I'm not going to blame it entirely on Peanut. He made some horrible plays, but for the most part, he was just playing Kha'Zix at a level where he was super far behind in terms of gold, and that's almost impossible to end up playing out. But it is his fault for, you know, picking the champion, for drafting the champion in the first place. I think Delight was also really bad this series. I don't think the scoreline really indicates how poor he played, especially in that third and final game on Rel. Couple of really horrible engages, a lack of peel really at all for his primary carry in Viper for a majority of this series. Just not a typical Delight series. He really showed that he could survive even outside of the Gen.G ecosystem last split on HLE, where he was incredibly good, a world-class support once again. Not a great start here. I imagine he will bounce back, but I do want to give some credit to Viper, who continues to be fine. Doran was actually pretty good. I know the scoreline doesn't indicate that, but Skarner is one of those champs that is just generally useful, even if he's 0-5 like he was in game number 3, so I don't want to blame Doran. I don't think it was his fault. He was the best player in game number 2. I think Zeka was generally fine. Again, his scoreline looks worse than it is. Showmaker was definitely better than him, which is certainly something to note, but it really was Peanut and Delight for me that stood out with the negative plays. So HLE definitely going to look to rebound from this. This is not how they wanted to start their summer split, but DK, this is just about as good as it gets. They were trending upwards towards the end of playoffs, and it seems that has carried over so far, especially with Lucid. If he's going to be a good jungler, like an above average jungler for this team, that's going to be huge for what DK can do. I really trust Showmaker, and the rest of this team is good enough. This could be an easy Worlds team if they keep this pace up. And then moving on to our second series of day number 1, and it's kind of a bottom of the table clash too. Not particularly interesting teams. NS RedForce taking on FearX here, and FearX is going to pick up the win, as they should here. They're probably the best of the rest in terms of the bottom 4. We've talked about that a lot on the channel, where it feels like bottom 3 are just kind of in their own zone. They are not particularly competitive when it comes to the rest of the league, and FearX is not nearly good enough to get into the top 6, but probably a little bit better than the really bad teams in the bottom 3. That continues to hold true here. They had enough going for them in this series to end up winning it, but this was not clean. Like, this was not a good series from FearX, and I think it did expose a lot of their issues as well. It's just Nongshim is worse, and that means that, you know, FearX ends up taking it. So we'll talk about it. Player of the series, pretty hopefully, is going to go to Raptor. This is a really good sign for FearX. This was their only mid-season change, was Willer going out and Raptor coming in. You know, I was pretty critical of this decision, if only because I really like Willer. I actually was pretty positive about Raptor in my primer video. I talked about how I liked him as a prospect. I thought he could come in and be interesting. I was interested in him a couple of years ago when it was announced that he was potentially going to be starting for Bro. That ended up not happening. He was on the bench, and then obviously he goes over here to FearX. I like him as a potential LCK jungler. I just think that Willer was the only good thing going for this team, and so I didn't really understand the decision to switch that up. This is clearly a very different style. Willer was much more of a carry presence on this team. He wanted a lot more of the resources from FearX. It seems that Raptor is not going to be doing that. He played Vi and Maokai throughout this series and was definitely more of a facilitator, but in a good way. Like, he was able to carry on the Vi in a lot of these really important moments. The Maokai wasn't quite as good. You know, the brand was definitely more useful in that second game, but games 1 and 3 were so positive from Raptor, I had no choice but to give him player of the series. I do also want to give a shout out to Closer. Pretty solid series from him, not going into the toughest of competition. This has always been kind of the Closer thing, as he will dominate the bad mids and just not be very good against the actual good mid laners. You know, Closer gets hyped up every so often, you know, once or twice a split, because, oh my god, like, Closer's breaking out now, and, you know, he's a T1 product, 2 T1 products, by the way, in the mid lane in this series, but Closer is just whatever. He's like a slightly average to maybe a little bit below average mid laner right now in the league. He was fine against Fisher, but Fisher has been horrible. So Raptor, Closer, at least looking like they have some sort of synergy as a jungle mid duo. That's a good place to start. Everybody else was fine. Like, I'm not going to criticize the rest of the team too much. Clear, Henna, Execute. They all kind of did their jobs. No one was really bad in this series. Henna actually did some really interesting things on Jhin. I continue to think that champion is really undervalued. I see a lot of people really mocking it online, but it just performs well every single time it's on the Rift. It's been really successful so far in the summer split. I think it fits the meta really well. It fits the team comps that are becoming popular really well. I think we're going to see more Jhin as we continue to move on in the year. Clear and Execute, they were fine. FearX just doesn't really excite me though. Hopefully Raptor can be what Willer was for this team, a primary facilitator, maybe just in a different role. Maybe instead of being the primary, carry threat and somebody who gets a lot of the resources for himself, he can be somebody who gets a lot of resources for the rest of his team. That could be a positive thing overall. But Raptor looked good in Series 1, and I think that's the best sign you can see. And then for Nongshim, they're just not a good team. Like, they're relying a lot on players who have proven basically nothing. It's really funny because I think the scorelines maybe were a little bit worse than maybe what they played. I don't think FearX dominated them by any means in this series. Fisher was generally fine. This might even be the best series that he's played so far in 2024 because he was that terrible on Edward Gaming over in the LPL. I can't stress enough just how horrible he was in the LPL, but he was fine. He survived in this series for the most part. He wasn't very good in lane, but he did fine out of lane, which I guess you can survive with. My concerns are that the players that are supposed to be the rocks of this team that are supposed to push them over the top weren't good. Sylvie and Jiwoo are supposed to be the two that you're kind of relying on. Sylvie's going to get dead of the series. I get it. The brand game was really good, and I'm not trying to take that away from him, but Nidalee and Sejuani in games 1 and 3 were horrible. He was clearly the worst player on the team in their 2 losses, and I think that's a bit of a concern. He did make some strides in the spring split after a really bad rookie year in 2023. That does not seem to have carried over, at least into the first series. Going to give him some time. He's never been a consistent player, so I'm not going to panic yet, but Jiwoo is a bit more concerning. This guy has been nothing other than elo held on Nongshim over the course of this series, been way too good for this roster, and he was not good in this series, was definitely worse than Henna on the other side of this matchup, was just not relevant really at all, was not winning fights, was not even winning in the 2v2, just a bit concerning, something to continue to monitor. Guger is playing pro for the first time in like 4 years. Happy for him. Happy that he showed back up. He was generally okay. Like, I thought that there were going to be worse engages from him. He wasn't good, but he wasn't bad, and I think you can live with that. And then Din, obviously not as good as Clear. I think Din's not particularly strong at this level, but Nongshim's just not good. This is a perfectly adequate performance for one of the worst teams in the league, and a perfectly adequate performance for one of, the teams that shouldn't be making playoffs in FearX. Like, yes, they won. They didn't look particularly good while doing it, but at least they were better than the worst team in the league. That's kind of the hope here for FearX, and so far, at least they're living up to that expectation. And then moving on now to day number 2, and we kick day 2 off with another really interesting series to talk about. The Kwangdong Freecs taking on KT Rolster, and KDF picking up a strong 2-0 series win. Our first 2-0 of the summer split here, going to KDF over KT. This is a big win for them, and I think even more so because of the circumstances surrounding their roster and surrounding this win. Leaper and Ondil are in as the bot lane duo. Talked about this very briefly, like super briefly in my primer. Honestly, I don't blame people for missing it if they just were looking at the graphic, or if they only listened to parts of the video, if you didn't understand or hear me talk about Leaper really at all. I don't know anything about this guy. I've never seen him play. I tried to find footage for the primer, but I couldn't find any, and so okay, I'm sure he might be good, he might be bad. That's essentially what I said there, but I had to grade Bull because he was the only player I had actually seen tape of, and I said if Leaper was going to start, it was going to be a huge risk. This guy's been a streamer for a little while. I don't really know what he's going to offer. He's not really been in the competitive scene at all for a little while, ever since he was like a trainee, so just no idea what he would offer as an AD carry. And then Ondil, obviously, I talked about the inconsistencies that he offered, but it seemed like this team wanted to go with Quantum because they started him in their playoff series. I was wrong about both of those. Leaper and Ondil are going to be the starting bot lane here for KDF, and that really worked out, at the very least, in this first series. For KT Rolster, we'll quickly talk about casting being in the top lane. If someone wants to let me know why that happened, I would love to hear that. Perfect is not in the lineup. It's fine. It didn't really affect the series all that much, but I don't really know why casting was starting. Again, if someone wants to let me know, that would be great. But we'll talk about KDF first and foremost. Player of the series is going to go to Leaper. It's so crazy how well new AD carries come in and play for KDF, especially when they aren't expected to come in and play well at all. Really funny how that ends up happening. Bull, obviously, in week 2 of last year, and Leaper here in week 1 of the summer split. He was awesome. I mean, truly, like, incredible. The mechanics were there. The aggressiveness was there. This was a top-tier AD carry performance. This was not just like a, oh, he's good. This is like a, oh, he's really good kind of performance from Leaper. So, really excited to see where that ends up going. The Jhin, in particular, in game number 2 was really strong. I continue to tell you guys how strong Jhin is. I know r/League of Legends would be furious to hear me say that, but Jhin is in a really good spot right now. Going into the summer split, this is not the same Jhin that we've been seeing in spring and last year and, you know, all of those times. This is a very different Jhin, and he actually is able to carry games pretty consistently, and he still has the utility. I think he is a very valuable pick. Him and Ashe, I do think, are probably the 2 best AD carries in the game right now. That would be my, you know, evaluation of the bot lane meta, at least from a competitive standpoint, and I think we continue to see that. But Ondol was also very good. It's really funny. Ondol, another player who also just plays better when you swap in a new AD carry for him. We saw it with Bull, where he was really bad with Taiyun. Bull comes in. Ondol looks incredibly good as a support, and then Bull, you know, doesn't really, you know, keep up that same kind of pace. Ondol ends up looking really bad towards the back half of his time in the spring split. Now he's got a new ADC and he looks good again, so we'll see if he can keep that up. But the rest of this team was fine as well. Cousin Bulldog still have pretty decent synergy. I want to see Bulldog get a little bit more aggressive with some of these picks, especially on the Tristana in game 1. It was still good, but I want to see a little bit more of that, you know, trigger pulling. I don't want to see him get passive as a player. His aggressiveness is what I loved about him in the first place, and Cuz was really good on Maokai. Dudu was fine going into a sub top laner. Didn't really have to do a whole ton in this series. This was all about the bot lane for KDF, and that's exciting. And then for KT on the other side, it's unfortunate that it seems that they've rolled an 0-2 week to start the year. We've joked about this a lot, but because they are KTRX, as we like to call them, they are destined to go 2-0-0-2, 2-0-0-2, just as DRX did in 2022. And that kind of held true, at least for a little bit, for parts of the spring split. They, of course, went on a bit of a streak down the stretch, but this is a team that is likely to go 0-2 on any given week if their players are not up to standard. That's always been kind of the case for them, and unfortunately, Pyosik and Beryl are going to influence whether or not this team is going to win games, and they were just not good enough in a series like this. Beryl's going to get done of the series. That's a pretty familiar thing to hear if you followed this channel for the past couple of years. Beryl gets a lot of these done of the series. He's just not particularly consistent in the regular season, but Deft also got outplayed. This really is like a bot lane done of the series for KT. Deft was really good in the spring split. He was super aggressive. He wanted to take a lot of fights 2v2, and he really wanted to be a primary carry for the team. Going to be interesting to see if that style ends up getting punished a bit more going into summer. It certainly did in this series, but who knows? The jungle was losing, so there really wasn't a lot that, you know, KT could do in terms of their lanes. BDD was not really relevant. Casting was not really relevant. There's really not a lot to talk about in terms of his LCK debut. This really was Leaper and Ondil being better than Deft and Beryl, and that's a pretty crazy thing to say. It's funny. Leaper was, I believe, in the team, the DRX team with Deft. I believe that he trained under Deft. If that's incorrect, you can let me know, but I believe he was a trainee on DRX when Deft was there, and so for him to beat him in his debut series is pretty ridiculous, and to beat Deft and Beryl, the DRX world champions, in his debut series is pretty cool. So, you know, KT unfortunately rolling 0-2 to start this year. I'm kidding, of course, they still have the chance to go 1-1 this week. I'm not going to count them out yet, but we know that this team tends to have either good weeks or bad weeks and not, you know, 1-1. Like, it doesn't really split it often, and then this is a huge win for KDF. This is a really monumental victory for them. Beating anybody in the top 4 is big for any teams that aren't in the top 4 or in the top 5 to really kind of push them above where they're supposed to be in terms of their record. You know, if Leaper and Ondil can keep this up, they can do a lot of interesting things, but it's not really about one series. It's going to be about the consistency with which they show. And then moving on to our second series of day number 2, and it's another bottom of the table clash. It's OK BRION taking on DRX. And DRX is going to pick up a win here. They're going to move to 1-0, and this is big for them. Just the confidence of knowing that they can win a series. I think some of the decisions they made in the middle of this series, really the one major substitution, was a positive for them overall, as I've been claiming would be a positive for them for a long time. And, you know, I'm not going to wait and try to build up suspense. I'm going to say it now. If you guys want to jump on the play to train, hop on. Like, I've been here since 2021. If you guys want to jump on the train before it really gets going, before like in a year we're talking about him as one of the better supports in the LCK, then hop on. We're welcoming everybody. Don't feel like we're trying to exclude anybody. I'm happy to include you all on the play to train because it is going to start to roll. This guy is ridiculous. You know, slowly moving over to Bro. They are not a good team. They have 2 interesting players. Shout out Morgan, shout out Young Jae. The bottom half of this map is so criminally horrible role. They don't really seem to have anybody that can play in those roles, and it ends up creating a situation where Bro just can't win games. Like, they cannot consistently do anything on the map because their weak links are just simply too weak. It's been a big problem for them throughout a majority of the split. I know I got some pushback for claiming that Bro, you know, their offseason was the worst in the world. Like, I think I claimed that they had the worst offseason of any team in the world. That's playing out on the Rift. All of their changes have been negative, and especially their non-changes have been negative. So we'll get to them, but for DRX player of the series, it's going to go to Playta. Come on, man. This guy is crazy. Like, what do we need to see? At what point do we just look at this guy and go, okay, he's the next superstar support in the LCK? I've seen so much delight in him where he's on this bad team and he doesn't really have a lot going for him, but you take him off of that, if you just inserted him into a really good team right now, I think he could show up as a top, 5-ish support in the world. Like, I'm not going to guarantee that that would happen, but he's got the mechanics to do so. This guy just makes every game easier for DRX. They still managed to lose a lot of them, but he has been phenomenal all year long. He's been by far the best player on DRX. All of that credit that Teddy gets for these awesome score lines and the lack of deaths and yada, yada, yada. Like, I'm sorry. Like, I wish I could be on the Teddy hype train as much as everybody on Reddit is, but I'm just not. Playta is by far the best player on DRX. He has been all year long, and it's so easy to see for me when I watch the tape. Like, it is so simple. It makes it so easy to recognize when you watch the tape for me. I get the score lines look good for Teddy, and Teddy didn't have a bad series, but he just was not the one creating. Now, I'm not going to sit here and criticize him. He was in a perfect situation in this series. Teddy's ideal situation as a player has always been him not having to really do all that much, just be given the keys and win 5v5s. Like, don't give him the responsibility of generating his own resources. He's not particularly good at that. He's not aggressive. He doesn't have the mentality to be the primary option on a team. But if you have a support who's going to go out there and set up a lot of kills for you and basically give you a lot of free gold, Teddy is just about as good as almost any ADC in the LCK at capitalizing on that particular circumstance. Teddy, he's like a supercharged version of Patrick in my brain, for those of you who follow the LEC, where Patrick just doesn't really do a whole ton. He kind of sits in the bot lane, and if his team is ahead, he's going to look good in team fights. He's going to capitalize on that really well. If his team is behind, he's not really going to be the one to save the game. That's Teddy. Like, Teddy's just a more mechanically talented version of that. He just doesn't have the mentality to be like a carry, but if you have someone like Playta, like, generating as much as they were able to in this series, it makes it a lot easier. I also think Sponge was really good in their win in game number 2. Wasn't consistent really at all throughout the rest of this series, but I'll take any bright spot I can get when it comes to Sponge, because he's not been good this year, really, under any circumstance. So for him to be good in game 2 is solid. Yehu was just the most consistent player throughout the series. He was the only player that was trying in game number 1 on the Jace, and this team got way better once Frog came into the top lane. I'm just done with Rascal. I mean, I've been done with Rascal since last year. I feel pretty good about being really early on that train. I got a lot of hate at the beginning of the year when I did my spring primer video for saying that Rascal was washed and that I really wouldn't expect him to turn things around and that he gets defended way too much on Reddit and on social media. Well, turns out that ended up being true. Frog is clearly an upgrade to this team, if only because he doesn't insta-lose 1v1 in the top lane, and Rascal just needs to go figure things out elsewhere. Just does not feel like he is good enough to play in the LCK at the moment. But really, the star for me is Playta. Like, I hate to just stick on my preseason analysis, but this guy is simply too good to be on DRX, and that continues to show. And then for Bro, again, they've got some interesting pieces. Morgan's a good player, didn't really have a ton to do this series, but Youngjae actually did have a ton to do in this series, and I really like Youngjae. He was inconsistent on KDF when he was given his first opportunity, but he did show good flashes for that team. I think with more time in the LCK, he could actually turn into a pretty good jungler. I don't hate the addition here. I actually think it's a pretty clear-cut upgrade over Gideon. Gideon is an interesting player that did show flashes as well, but Youngjae has more upside in terms of the mechanics, in my opinion, and we continue to see that, especially in an AP meta. I think this fits Youngjae really well. Even Karis wasn't horrible, I guess, here. Like, he was generally fine into Yehu, who was better than him, but not by a ridiculous amount. It was the bot lane who let this team down. Polu, in particular, was horrendous. He's going to get done to the series. The support gap in this one was ginormous. Polu could not compete at all with what Playta was doing. He could not keep up with any of the engages, especially because he did try to match engage support for engage support, which just did not work out. It was not ever going to be in the realm of possibility. This team wants to flip between Samver and Envy basically randomly, it would seem. I think think their best case scenario is just to land on one of them. I honestly don't think they're all that different in terms of performances. I'm not a huge Envy lover, as is pretty well known on this channel. I'm not a huge Samver lover. He's really not been all that good for this team either. So whoever you want to play there, just whatever, just get some continuity for this team because it feels like they have none. Bro is the worst team in the LCK. They were last split, and I would expect them to be again. This was best case scenario in terms of some of their performances. Only one player really running it down, and they still weren't able to beat a team like DRX. That's kind of a disaster. I don't know how many games this team is going to win over the course of this split, but for DRX, nice win. I don't think it's going to translate into a lot. This team still has a lot of holes and a lot of problems, but I like Yehu. I think Teddy and Plates could be fine as a bot lane duo. This team could be better than bottom two by a considerable margin, but that's only going to be kind of figured out with time. At least for now, they are better than Bro at the very least. And then moving on to day number 3 now, our middle day here in week number 1. Pretty good matchup to kick off day number 3. It's FearX taking on Gen.G. Our defending champions play for the first time in the summer split, and Gen.G picks up the win 2-0, although this was actually pretty competitive. You know, ups to Fox because they played pretty well in this series, all things considered. Obviously, they were never in danger of, like, winning a game. Like, that was never on the table, but Fox actually was in a position to make Gen.G go out and try to win the game, and that's all you can really ask from them, is to push them in some way, shape, or form. It's a pretty decent 1-in-1 week for them, all things considered, but Gen.G should have won this, and it should not have been close, and that's exactly kind of what happened. They were never really in danger of losing either of these games. I think the scaling was always on their side. Game 2 was definitely a lot more up in the air, but Clear was so out of it, it was essentially a 4v5, and then on top of that, you're Karthus, Corki, Senna going into late game team fights. Like, yeah, you're probably still in a pretty good position to win that game, even if you're not Gen.G and, like, the best team in the world. So I think you're going to feel pretty good about that, and you know what? They ended up executing, so who am I to really get mad at them? Player of the series is going to go to Pays. He got his pentakill in game number 1. I said this on Twitter. If you don't follow me on Twitter, first of all, link in the description. I tweet there sometimes, but Pays is, his spring worries are over. I would expect his spring worries to be done, unless teams just, like, perma-ban out Zeri, because truly he is the best Zeri in the world. I know some people will make some arguments for other players, but he is the best Zeri player in the world. I don't think it's particularly close, and if that champion is going to be meta again, if that champion is going to be playable at a top-tier level again, Pays is going to dominate people, just like he did last year. He just is unstoppable on that champion, especially in 5v5 team fights. This team knows how to play around him in a perfect way. Chovy, in particular, knows how to enable Pays on Zeri more than almost anybody that I've seen play with him. Lehens is obviously really good at that as well, and so I'm not worried about Pays anymore. He's going to be just fine if Zeri is going to be meta again. It might even become a permaban against this team. He really is that good at that champion, and it's almost unfair to play against it, but it was far from just Pays who was good here. Keen was excellent, especially in that second game on the Twisted Fate. Clear was completely destroyed. We'll get to him in a second, but the dude was, like, taken out of the game. Gen.G made it their mission to make it a 4v5 to make sure that Kennen absolutely could not exist, and Keen was a big reason why they were able to do that so successfully, because Keen was so difficult to end up taking down. So credit to Gen.G, credit to Keen. He was really good and was a big part of why Game 2 ended up being so easy down the stretch when it probably shouldn't have. Canyon is the best smiter in the world. It just kind of is what it is. He's so calm and cool under pressure. He never really gets rattled that those 50-50s are not 50-50s. Chovy's awesome on Corki. I think that champion is stronger now than it was last split, but I still think it's stronger in the bot lane than it is in the mid lane. And Lehens is Lehens. Like, he's arguably one of the best supports in the world. So Gen.G kind of performing up to expectation. They didn't really make any major errors, but I do want to commend Fox. Their macro was pretty good this series. I think that there were moments in game 2 where they actually were in it. Raptor did a really good job of keeping pressure on Gen.G. He really wanted to play that early, fast-paced Xin Zhao kind of game against the Karthus, and it did kind of work out. They had a lead in a lot of the mid game in gold, and they really were up in pressure. That's what's going to happen when you have Xin Zhao Tristana into Karthus plus Corki plus Senna, but they just weren't able to maintain it. Clear was completely taken out of the game, and he is unfortunately going to get dud of the series because of it. I'm not even sure it's entirely his fault. He just got so many resources dumped into completely destroying him, but he also was not good in the 1v1 against Keen. And so, yeah, you feel bad for him, but also if he were a champion really at all in this game, and if he were able to do Kennen things, if he were able to get on the backline, kind of blow up some of these squishies perhaps before they were able to get their damage in, because they really are a very squishy team, I think that this actually could have been a very easy Fox win in game number 2, but because Clear wasn't particularly relevant, there just was no shot. Everybody else was generally fine, though. Raptor and Closer in particular seem like they have very good chemistry as a duo. I think maybe Closer could do better now with Raptor as a jungle than with Willer, because Willer, like we said, is a little bit more of a damage carry. Closer, a little bit more of a damage carry, more of that assassin, aggressive type of player. Raptor going to be much more willing to give those resources to Closer, and I think that could make him look a little bit better as a mid laner, but I think they've been the strength of the team so far. Hanwha and Execute also weren't a huge problem. They really have not been bad this week at all. Fox looked okay in week number 1. They didn't look horrible. They certainly looked better than the bad teams in the league, and I think that that's something that you can hopefully hang your hat on. I don't know if this is going to be a top 6 team. It probably won't be, but at the very least, they look competitive, and Gen.G is not the kind of team that you should be looking competitive against, so credit to Fox. And, Gen.G didn't play bad either. They didn't make any sort of major errors. It's not like they were, giving the game to Fox. Fox just executed well, and they just barely weren't able to win because they're not as talented, and that's fine. Pays was really good, Keen was really good, Canyon was really good. You live with that if you're Fox, and so for Gen.G, it's a nice win. You did not want to go 0-1 at all to start this split, but that was never really in danger. This team was better, and I think they proved that. And then moving on to our second series of day number 3, and it's another debut of an MSI team from the LCK. It's T1 taking on NS RedForce, and predictably, T1 is going to pick up the 2-0 win. This is unlike the series earlier in the day. Because this one was not competitive. Nongshim did not put up the same kind of fight that Fox put up, even with Gen.G pretty comfortably having control of that series. T1 was able to kind of steamroll them in both of these games, even with some of the roster changes that they ended up making in the middle of the series. I don't think it really helped at all. In fact, I think it hurt this team more than it helped. I think if you're constantly swapping players in and out, trying to figure out who you want to play, all you're doing is hampering any semblance of communication that the team can build. Remember, League is a team game. League is a game where you have to get comfortable playing with your teammates and communicating in pretty pivotal and quick situations. It's really hard to do that when you're constantly swapping players in and out and in and out in a series. I don't think bad teams are ever going to get better if they continue this strategy. We'll talk about some of the positives that Nongshim had in this series, but of course we'll start with T1. Player of the series for me, maybe shockingly, is going to go to Gumayushi in the bot lane. He's on Senna duty, man. He is stuck on Senna duty, and he's going to live that role. At some point, I think teams are just going to have to ban this out against T1. Gumayushi just feels so comfortable on it, and T1 plays around it so perfectly that I don't want to say it's unbeatable, but it's pretty close to unbeatable at the LCK level. You can bet that teams like Gen.G, Hanwha Life, KT, Dplus KIA, they're going to be looking at Senna and saying, why would we play against Senna when we can force this team to play around something else? And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say that Guma can't perform on other champions. That is not what I'm trying to put forward. I think Guma is a very versatile player. We know he's good at a lot of different champions, but Senna fits this team's playstyle so well. It fits what KIA wants to do. It fits what Owner wants to do. Hell, it even fits what Faker wants to do, to the point where it helps them all kind of just play their own roles without really ever having to adapt. Take Guma off of Senna, and all of a sudden those resources become a little less free for the bot lane, and you do have to put a little bit more effort and time into planning out where you want to go with those routes. Do I think it will matter all that much? Maybe not, but right now it's not even trying to take them out of their comfort zone, which is certainly not an ideal situation. Guma just feels so comfortable and so good on the Senna, and the team plays so well around it that it's almost impossible to end up taking down. It makes Faker's job easier, it makes Owner's job easier, and like I said, it makes KIA's job a lot more aggressive and a lot more fun. It unlocks him to go and do a lot of the things he's really good at. He was really good in this series. He's going into a support who hasn't played pro in 4 years. Of course, KIA looked really good in this series. Bot lane was solid, but Owner and Faker were also great. It's not like jungle mid ended up letting them down in any sort of way. Faker was excellent. He still has that global taunt on Azir even after the nerfs. It's crazy that this team sees the meta that we're currently in and is yeah, we're just going to keep picking Viego, Azir, Senna, and we're not going to worry too much about it. It's just funny that with all of the changes on 14-11 that is the direction that they want to continue to go, but Faker is so good on Azir, it ends up not mattering. Owner was really good on the Viego in game number 1, was still very good on the Vi. In game number 2, they're just able to outskill the players that they're going into. It's not a huge shock. Zeus was by far the better top laner. They just decimated this series. It was not particularly close. T1 was in the driver's seat the whole time. Both of these games were basically identical, and that's a positive to T1. And then for Nongshim, both of these games were basically identical, and that's even with some of the roster substitutions. Din and Fisher played game number 1. Mihail and Calmy played game number 2. I don't know the direction that I would go in if I was Nongshim, but at the end of the day, I would just make a decision. I think swapping these guys in and out throughout a series is a huge mistake. I think it really limits the upside of this team because it never allows them to establish any sort of chemistry as a unit. I know that Din has not been good, and honestly, I would probably go with Mihail just to see what you have in the top lane, because Din is really garbage. He's going to get dead of the series, if only for that game 1 on the Gnar. He only played game number 1, but he got destroyed on Gnar in game number 1. He was never relevant. Fisher also got subbed out for Calmy, but both of them were generally fine. I don't think either made any noticeable change in terms of how the game was played. I would say that Fisher was maybe slightly better, like only narrowly better, but not really by a lot. Sylvie also just got out-jungled by Owner, was trying to make plays on the Sejuani, but as soon as he lost tempo and the fact that every single lane was losing made his life a living hell, Jiwoo was the only player even remotely trying. trying. And if that's not Nongshim in 2024, then I don't know what is. Like, that is the story of Nongshim, is everybody else on the team getting gapped and Jiwoo trying his best on a champion that has absolutely no right to be the one trying to carry the game. Get him off of this team. That's all I can beg. But Nongshim's not good. They're duking it out with Bro as the two worst teams in the league. I don't know who is actually worse. That we will have to wait and see, but Nongshim is certainly not doing themselves any favors by swapping in and out. And then, T1 looked good, not surprisingly good. Like, they looked exactly as they should have in a series like this. They looked about as good as you would anticipate, and that's a good sign. They were not tested at all. This is barely a first series of the year for them. We really gained and learned nothing. They looked incredible, but it's T1. Of course they did. Then moving on now to day number 4, and we kick day 4 off with a 1-0-0-1 matchup between the Kwangdong Freecs and OK BRION. The KDF is going to win. They're going to move to 2-0 after week number 1. Of course, this win a little bit more predictable than maybe their first of the week. This one definitely should have happened. The fact that they dropped game number 2 is not ideal for them, but we'll talk about them in just a second. I actually want to start with a little bit of talk about Bro, because this is something that is becoming like truly an issue for me at this point. This is something I want to complain about. This is something I really want to make sure I have a strong stance on, because I do have a strong stance on this. Stop substituting. Like, truly stop substituting. Nongshim and Bro feel like they're having a who can lose harder off right now, because they are sabotaging their own team so much harder than they need to. First of all, the best player on Bro in the first series was by far Gen.G, and he was actually really the player I was most excited to see what he could be for Bro. We know Morgan is a good player. We know that Karis and the bot lane are not going to be particularly good, and so Gen.G was really the player I was looking at in terms of this lineup and saying, well, what are you going to be? So subbing him out, putting Void back in here in the jungle for what is essentially no reason is absurd. And we'll get into how this was like literally a series losing decision in a second. But the bot lane as well, it's not even just jungle. Like Sam for Envy, game after game after game, it's flip-flop, flip-flop. They cannot decide who they want to put in. And quite frankly, it is destroying the chemistry and the communication of this team. It is clear that this team got worse as the series went on, and that's hilarious. Like, I don't mean to laugh at orgs and teams like this, but it is so grossly mismanaged and so poorly coached that they are quite literally choosing to lose games. And I couldn't imagine the circumstance in which that is okay and not worth being called out in any sort of respectable sense. Nongshim is doing a similar thing here. We'll get to another team that's kind of doing it in week number 1, who, spoiler alert, also doesn't have a particularly good week, but credit to KDF for being able to take advantage of that. I would have liked if they hadn't dropped game number 2 to Bro, if they hadn't allowed Envy to get super fed on the Kaisa and just kind of take over that game. That would have been ideal. Karis, I think, was playing better, and he's played better, I would say, at the start of this split than he has in quite a while, but really, you should not have lost game number 2. You are more talented than being a team that loses to Bro. You were able to get the job done in game number 3, being a bit more consistent, but again, I would have liked a bit more of a dominant performance from a team, in KDF that looks really good going into a team in Bro that looks, quite frankly, horrible. So that's really my only gripe here. Player of the series is going to go to Ondil in the support position. He looks really good at the start of this split, just as he looked really good at the start of last split as soon as Bull came in. Again, I hope he can keep that up. He's kind of been known to trail off as the split goes on, so if that happens again, it's going to be a bit disappointing, but a really good week number 1 from Ondil, a really good week number 1 from Leaper, who continues to look very good down in the bot lane. The Zeri was really solid for them. I don't really like the Senna Tom Kench. I don't think it worked for them. I think it's too passive for a bot lane that clearly does want to be kind of a resource carry for this team. Leaper getting him adjusted to the league by letting him just be the focal point for where this team wants to put a lot of their pressure, I think is going to be a positive for him overall. It clearly worked in their first series, and it worked in game number 3 in particular in this series, so I would imagine that would be something that they are going to continue to do moving forward. Bulldog also picks up pentakills in this series. I think his scoreline looks a little bit better than he played, but Corki continuing to show why that champion is indeed much stronger now after the changes than he was before the changes, and he was already getting a ton of play before the changes. Corki is just in a really good spot. I still think he would be stronger in the bot lane, but he looks strong in the mid lane as well, and Bulldog obviously played some of those fights well. Cuz was good here, definitely the better jungler, and Dudu finally had a good Skarner game in game number 3. It felt like this guy just did not know how to play this champion. Maybe it's taking him some time to pick up the champ, it's new and all, but game number 3, it finally felt like he was figuring out what he wanted to do in that matchup, so credit to him. But this was really Ondil and Bulldog, in my opinion, kind of being the carries. Ondil was the main one, and probably the most consistent player across the series, but if you want to just go purely on damage numbers and on the ability to carry team fights, you could give Bulldog player of the series, and I honestly wouldn't be all that upset with you. But Ondil definitely deserves deserves at least some shout out. I think he's going to go under the radar for how well he played across all 3 of these games. But for Bro on the other side, I mean, Void's dead of the series. Like, what do you want me to say? This dude was unplayable in this series. And don't forget, you subbed out the only good player from your first series to play him in this one, a player who has at no point in time showed any sort of promise at the LCK level. I just don't get it. It truly is a self-sabotage kind of move. There is literally no explanation for this happening, and Void was horrible. If he continues to play for Bro, I'm going to be completely flabbergasted, and honestly, at that point, I'm going to think that Bro has some sort of insider knowledge, and they bet on themselves to lose games. Like, at that point, you need to be investigated by the league, because there genuinely is nothing else to say. Bot lane was a bit better. Envy is clearly a little bit better right now than Samver is. Samver is struggling at the beginning of this split. Envy at least had that good Kaisa game in Game 2. He might not be a good player, but he seems to be better than Samver. Karis, like I said, has actually been relatively okay to start this split. He's been horrid over the course of his career. It's good to see him at least not getting obliterated, even though he was the worst mid laner in this one. And then Polu, also really rough week for him. He was probably the worst player for Bro across all of their games, all, 6 of their games this week, but that's not really saying a whole ton. Like, this team is, like, really bad. This team is not good. And so Bro just continuing to self-sabotage. This team continues to put themselves in bad positions, and they are not making it better by their management and their coaching decisions. Quite frankly, I think that they are taking a team that doesn't have any talent and making them play worse, which is insane. But for KDF, yeah, I mean, 2-0 looks good. It's a little bit of a weird 2-0. The KT series is obviously a lot more encouraging than this one is. You didn't really want to lose the game to Bro, but at the very least, you were able to come out on top, and I think there are a lot of positive signs from this. Ondel is playing well. Leaper is playing well. If this bot lane can keep that up, that's going to make them more interesting in the end. And then, hopefully Bulldog takes that next leap. This was a really good series, but he really wasn't the one with the agency. So again, I want to see him, continue to grow in that aggressiveness sense. KDF is good right now, but I'm not going to go all in with the 2-0 week and say that they are now some sort of contender. And then moving on to our second series of day number 4, it's a playoff matchup from the previous split replicated here. It's KT Rolster taking on Dplus KIA. And DK once again gets the better of KT Rolster. It feels like this matchup is very DK favored, and generally this does track with kind of the trend that we've seen from KT, where when they're not winning, they are just not winning. They do not look particularly good. I want to reiterate, a lot of people are going to freak out about this 0-2 week from KT Rolster. This is not the most out of the realm possibility thing that we've ever seen. Like, 0-2 weeks are pretty normal for this, group of players, and I want to remind people, as good as BDD and Deft and Perfect are for this team, and we'll talk about that, Pioshik and Beryl are the only 2 members of this team that ever matter. They are the only 2 members that will ever determine whether or not this team will win or lose games. And that's not to say that Deft and BDD and Perfect are bad players and that they aren't impactful. It's just that that's how Pioshik and Beryl operate. They are so impactful on the game that they play that when they win the game for their team, and when they lose the game for their team. And unfortunately, they had a bad week, and that's pretty regular for these players, and they're now 0-2 because of it. You've got DK on the other side, who looked really good this week. I mean, that's a 2-0 week for DK, and both wins were teams in the top 4. That's a really good sign for DK, and hopefully that's something that they can continue to grow upon. I think the biggest encouraging factor for me is that player of the series is going to go to Lucid. He once again had a very good series here. Not only was he much better than Pioshik in their playoff run, not only was he really good against Gen.G in their playoff series as well, but he was really good in their first series of this week number 1. Like, he has just been really good over the last stretch of time, and Lucid was always a player that had ridiculous upside. We've talked about it a lot on this channel, but I still consider the LCK to the LCK Challengers League to be the biggest gap between Tier 1 and Tier 2 of any major region in the world. I don't think that, EU Masters to the LEC, or the NACL to the LCS, or the LDL to the LPL, I don't think any of those gaps are as big as Challengers League to the LCK. We have seen so many players come up through Challengers League and just not be good enough. Even if they were able to dominate at that level, they need time to get going, and I'm glad this organization has given Lucid time. I was very critical of Lucid and the performances that he was given, because he was getting hyped up so much as an LCK player, and he just didn't really seem to have the current ability, if you will, to kind of justify that. But it does seem like that development track is coming along. It seems like the time that they have given him is starting to pay off, and that the communication has gotten better, because he is just on point in terms of his macro in the first week here. His Vi flank in game number 3 single-handedly won them that fight, and his Poppy was really good this series as well. There really aren't a lot of negatives that I can give Lucid. Maybe he was a little too far forward at times, but I'd much rather him be too aggressive than too passive. I think for the most part, Lucid looked great in this series, and I want to give him a lot of credit for that. Aiming scoreline looks incredible. That's because he was donated so many resources by the rest of his team, but look what happens when you play Corki in the bot lane. This dude can absolutely pop off in terms of the damage. Game 1 is a great example of why I think that champion is a better bot laner than a better mid laner right right now. Kellen continues to be that player that's going to, push the go button. Sometimes it's going to work, sometimes it's going to not. You got to live with either result, but Kellen's not afraid to make plays. Kingen was a lot better on Aatrox. The Aatrox merchant returns here, but he was allowed to get the champion. Of course he looked good. And then Showmaker playing Talia, just enabling the rest of his team, enabling aiming, enabling Lucid to go and make those plays. This was kind of a team effort. I think Lucid definitely was the one that was catching my eye the most, but aiming the damage carry, and Kingen looked really good on the Aatrox, and there's a lot of things to shout out when it comes to DK in terms of their performance that I think I'm excited about, and 2-0 is certainly something to get excited about, but for KT on the other side, again, Pyosik and Beryl will determine everything, and when they're not playing well, they are going to lose. Pyosik is going to get done of the series, completely out-jungled by Lucid in basically every facet, whether it was on Sedge or Kindred. It didn't really matter. Pyosik just didn't really ever feel like he had control of these games, control of this series, and that's an incredibly disappointing thing to say. Again, if Pyosik's not playing well, they're probably not going to win. Beryl also had a very bad week, I think almost an underratedly bad week. He is never going to get the kind of negative press that, he will deserve with some of his performances because people love him. He's like such a fan favorite. He's such a popular figure. Even in my comments section, like typically speaking on these weekly reviews, I don't get like a ridiculous amount of pushback. That is more so saved for the primers and for the opinion-based videos that I do at the beginning of every split and every year. But Beryl is honestly somebody that I get like the most negative feedback from in terms of my opinion, but I'm not going to waver on it. He's going to have bad games and he's going to have bad weeks, and those are kind of frequent, and this was another one of those. I do want to shout out Perfect. Came in game numbers 2 and 3. Again, I still don't know why he was out. If you want to let me know, but he came in games 2 and 3 and was by far the best player on KT Rolster in this series. It wasn't even particularly close. He was really the only one even trying to win, so again, I hope to see more of Perfect because he kind of feels like the best player on KT at times right now, but this team just doesn't have any sort of consistency, any sort of cohesion in that phase. If Pyosik and Beryl suddenly turn it around in week 2, I'm not going to be shocked if they come out and absolutely obliterate some bad teams. I'm not going to be shocked, but it's really not going to change my opinion of this team all that much. Even them losing 0-2 here is not going to change my opinion of this team all that much. They have problems that they need to fix, and a lot of that just comes down to consistency and game-to-game stuff. But for DK, 2-0 is about as dream of a start as you can get against teams like Hanwha Life and KT. Like, you couldn't have asked for a better week than this, and I think they're going to be really, really happy moving into week 2. And then moving on to our 5th and final day of LCK action here in week number 1. Wrapping up the week, we have a matchup between Hanwha Life Esports and DRX that HLE is thankfully going to be able to take in 3 games. If they fell to 0-2 this week, that would have been about as disastrous of a start as you could possibly ask for, and about as uncalled for of a bad start as you could possibly ask for. But they kind of got bailed out because DRX just played game 3 so poorly that it didn't really matter what ended up happening. There were a couple of good moments from their side, but I think a lot of the positives from them in this series came in game number 2. I think a lot of the good score lines that you're seeing from DRX came in game number 2. I think, again, if they had been even remotely playable in game number 3, this could have been a lot worse for HLE because there were some problems with this team, but both of their wins, pretty concrete. I am still worried about this team. I'm not going to just drop all of my concerns because they beat DRX, but at least they were able to go 1-1 this week, which stabilizes at least their record, but pretty easy choice for me for player of the series. It's going to go to Doran in the top lane. That Skarner was so impactful in game number 3, and honestly, there's really no other way to say it. Like, Doran was by far the best player on Hanwha Life in week number 1. It wasn't even really particularly close. I get that there were some good performances from Delight here. He was really good in game number 1. I should say, not game number 3. Game number 1 on the Alistair was setting up a lot for Viper, who was able to capitalize, and Viper really didn't make a lot of mistakes over the course of this week. Maybe a few more early on against DK, but not nearly as many here against DRX. He was generally pretty fine, but, everybody else, concerns, and Delight was really bad in the previous series as well. Zeka was not good in game number 2 on the Azir. Azir just generally feels pretty weak right now outside of Faker. Nobody's really been able to make that work so far in the summer split, and Peanut just didn't really have a Peanut week. Like, he was really not particularly strong in week 1, so there are real concerns, but at least Doran played well. Top side's really important in the LCK because top lane is really strong. If you're able to consistently win on that stage, or on that side of the map, I should say, then you have a lot easier of a time of generating that pressure and translating it into the mid game, and I think Doran did that at a really high level this week. Even in their loss earlier this week to DK, he was definitely the better top laner between him and Kingen, and if Doran can continue to be a top 3 top laner, then this team is going to be fine on that side, and I imagine things will equalize, things will stabilize out for the rest of this map at some point, even if it hasn't already. So, are there concerns for HLE? Absolutely. There are some genuine, real concerns. Zeka needs to stop picking Azir. I know he's good at the champ, but the champ is not in a good state right now. Delight clearly needs to clean up some of his gameplay. He is making a lot of mistakes, and Peanut is probably the worst culprit of all. He did not have a good week number 1, but at least there was enough to get them over DRX, which is like the bare minimum. That is the least they could do in a series like this. To DRX's credit, they played well at times, especially in Game 2. I thought the jungle mid duo was really solid in Game 2. Sponge and Yehu, I think, did a really good job. That Aurelion Sol was very, very hard for HLE to deal with. A-Sol is another one of those champs that I would just imagine is going to gain more prio as the year goes along. We haven't seen nearly the same kind of length of game in the East that we have in the West. In the West, games are being dragged out. They are going a lot longer than you traditionally would expect, but that has not translated really at all to the LCK. They've still been relatively quick games for at least the good teams, and, you know, maybe picks like A-Sol and Kai'Sa aren't going to be as relevant in a situation like that, but again, they could have had a chance here if it weren't for Topside, which just got absolutely destroyed. We talked about the good parts of Doran. Let's talk about the dud of the series, which is going to go to Frog. As much as I don't like Rascal, Frog was really horrible here. I still think you go with Frog moving forward, and I know that sounds crazy with how bad he was against Doran in this matchup, but Doran is a really good top laner, and Rascal wouldn't probably have done much better. There were circumstances where Rascal got beat just as hard as Frog did in this series last split, let alone all of last year as well, and so, you know, it doesn't feel like you have a good answer in that top lane. It feels like basically no matter who you play there, they're going to be a net negative. They're going to be near the bottom of the league in terms of top lane rankings, but at least Frog has not shown that he is going to consistently be horrible at this level yet. Like, that's the kind of upside that you're holding on to, but yeah, Doran completely obliterated him, and he solo lost game number 3 on that Rumble. I think Teddy and Plato were fine. Teddy's going to be continuously looked at as, oh, hard stuck. Oh, he only has to play with so many bad players over the course of his career. Again, I'm over dramatic in terms of how I present this information, but Teddy was fine. He didn't really do anything this series. People are going to claim that he got elo held. He didn't really do anything in any of these games. He was pretty good in game number 2 on the Kai'Sa, but so was everybody else. So DRX is just one of those teams that I think will be better than the worst in the league, as we saw earlier against Bro. Not a playoff contender. This is still not a good team. Don't get it twisted. And HLE honestly is concerning me in terms of how they played in week 1. This was not a dominant week 1. This was a concerning week number 1 for HLE. 1-1 I think is a blessing considering the gameplay that they showed, and I think they have a lot of things that they need to clean up, a lot of inconsistencies that they just didn't really show last split. So, you know, I know it's not disaster world. It's not like pull the plug just yet, but a lot of things need to get better for them right now. And that's going to bring us to our final series of the week, and it is definitely the most anticipated series of the week, a finals rematch between these two teams. It's T1 taking on Gen.G, and Gen.G absolutely obliterates them. This series was not close. Both of these games were not close, and there is one man to thank for that. I'm not going to give all of the credit to one player, because I don't think that's necessarily fair. I do think that there is a lot of credit to go around for the plays that were made in this series, but I would be remiss to give player of the series to anyone other than Paze, who obliterated this matchup. This is the cleanest Ezreal I have seen in a very, very long time at the pro level. Sometimes you get Ezreal and it's just like, you know, the player's clearly good at Ezreal, but they can't really do a whole ton. They're not really getting as much of their damage off as you would want. Like, there are just some good, not great Ezreal performances. This was one of the best Ezreal performances I have ever seen across both of these games. He was untouchable. There was nobody that was ever going to land a skill shot on him. He dominated the 2v2. I mean, he utterly obliterated Gumayushi early on in these laning phases, which just should never really happen if you are Ezreal, and he was untouchable in team fights as well. He was doing 1 billion damage per fight. This is genuinely one of the best Ezreal performances I've seen. Like, I don't want to be hyperbolic when I say that. He 1v9'd. Like, the rest of this team was super good. Chovy went deathless. Canyon was awesome on Nidalee. Lahens, we'll get into, was incredible on the Leona, but Paze could have 1v9'd if he was asked to do so. He was that good today, and he was that good in week number 1. You know, summer always felt like kind of Paze's thing. He leveled up as the year went on last year as well. He was my pick for MVP of the summer split last year. I mean, it's looking pretty good in week number 1. I'm not going to try to, you know, say that he's just going to win MVP after 1 week of action, but it does feel like a lot of the problems that he had in the spring split might not be nearly as relevant as we head into summer here. But, you know, talking about the rest of the team, Lahens was exceptional on the Leona, a couple unbelievably great engages. When Leona's played at a high level, it makes me remember why that champion is still picked. Sometimes I worry, like, why are we picking Leona over Nautilus? Why are we picking it over Rel? Why are we picking over Alistar? You know, after the nerfs, is Leona really that relevant, like, in comparison to those champions? And then someone like Lahens comes around and just utterly dominates on the pick, and I go, oh, yes, she is. Like, this is what Leona can do when played at a super high level. Sometimes bad Leonas don't make it look all that good, but Ezreal Leona looked unplayable. Like, you couldn't play against it in this series. There was nothing to do. Paze and Lahens were the 2 best players on the Rift, and it was by an absolute canyon. And that's considering Canyon was honestly as Nidalee. Chovy went deathless on Corki and Yone. Keen was excellent in this series on 2 games of Skarner, and he was great in week 1 in general, obliterated Zeus. Like, everyone won on Gen.G, but bot lane was the focal point, and bot lane was the lane that they got a gigantic lead in. This was utterly transcendent play from Gen.G, and I'm not sure we're going to see it out of these 2 players again. Not to say that they can't live up to this, just that I don't know if this kind of performance is replicable. That's how good it was. And then for T1, I mean, hold your hat up and say, like, okay, Pays and Lahens just had one of those series where they were not going to lose. Like, it did not matter who they went up against in this series. It could have been us. It could have been Billy Gaming. It could have been anybody. There was no one that was going to beat Gen.G in this series. It's how it is. Like, T1 could have played better. The bot lane got completely destroyed. Gumayushi is going to get dud of the series here because he wasn't nearly as good as Pays in lane. He gave Pays a lot of resources and honestly just had to forfeit a lot of the pressure that they were able to get in the bot lane. Also was taken off of Senna and wasn't nearly as relevant, not because he is bad, but because the team doesn't play around it particularly well. Keria wasn't good. I think he was a little bit more useful on the Rel, if only because Rel just has a lot of uses and generally speaking is going to be relevant just for peel and engage, but it's not like he had anything to peel for. These fights were never particularly close. Zeus got obliterated on the top side of this map by Keen. Zeus was really good in the regular season last year, but Keen is his kryptonite. Keen has destroyed him every single time that these 2 have played, and Zeus doesn't really seem to have any sort of answer to it. He relies so much on his mechanics that when he goes up against somebody else who is also mechanically talented, if not more mechanically talented than he is, he has no answer. He has no response. The Cassante was horrible in game 2. The Twisted Fate was also bad in game 1. I get it, it's Skarner, but you have to be able to survive in these games, and Owner and Faker certainly couldn't do anything. It's not like they had pressure. It's not like they were winning. T1 just got throttled. They got destroyed. This wasn't close, but it's Gen.G. I still think this is the second best team in the league, but to me, that's the difference between Gen.G and everyone else right now. Gen.G proved at MSI they are the best team in the world, and all they have done since then is continuously prove that. Some people will look at the Fox series and say like, oh, well, Fox was way closer to beating them than they had any right to be. Maybe they've gotten worse. No, absolutely not. They didn't even make mistakes in the Fox series. They just allowed Fox to play their game and then were like, screw it, we're going to win now. They obliterated T1. They're going to obliterate anybody that even remotely challenges them. Right now, there is just no other conversation other than Gen.G being the best team in the world, and it's not even really all that close. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCK week number 1 overview and analysis video here in the summer split. Up on the screen, the updated standings after 1 week of LCK action. Of course, any ties will just be broken alphabetically, not trying to show any favoritism. It's a lot easier with game score to not have as many ties as it would be in some of the other regions that do best of ones, but we also have my updated power rankings on the screen. Those are going to be located in the first column to the right and the second column to the right. The column power ranking will show where I personally power rank these teams from number 1 to number 10 right now. The change column will be how that has changed from last week to this week, or I guess from the preseason to this week. So we can go over risers and fallers. Maybe not as many changes as some would believe, because I don't know how many of these things are going to be like replicable for a lot of these teams, but the only big change, really the only change at all, DK jumping up to number 3 in my power rankings. They beat HLE, they beat KT. They jump up above both of them to number 3. T1 is going to stay at number 2. Gen.G is going to stay at number 1. I don't think I really have to explain that one all that much. Gen.G is clearly number 1, and T1, even with that loss, is still clearly number 2. For me, still the favorite to get that number 2 seed to make the finals, but DK is going to jump up to 3 because they look the best by far out of those other teams in week number 1. HLE and KT are both going to drop 1 because of that. HLE is pretty lucky that they were able to beat DRX, but KT Rolster, a traditionally bad week for Pioshik and Barrel. I imagine they will bounce back at some point and end near 500, somewhere around the end of this regular season. That's my anticipation, and that's probably the 5th best team in the LCK. KDF, even with their 2-0 week, is going to stay at number 6 until they prove that they can keep it up. I'm not really going to believe the hype. Again, I'm not going to try and shut down the hype, but they could have looked a lot better this week, even with the 2-0, than maybe what some people would believe just on the surface. I'm not buying into this team entirely just yet, but clearly they are the final playoff team at the moment. And then everybody else at the bottom is still bad. Fox is clearly the best of the rest. I think that became pretty clear this week, and then DRX was able to win a game, which is why they stay at number 8. Nongshim and Bro stay at 9 and 10 respectively, because both of them were horrible. Whatever order you want to put them in, I think is generally fair, but I trust Bro even less, especially with all the substitutions. They're sabotaging their own team harder than anybody else in the LCK. So let me know if you disagree or agree with my power rankings down in the comment section below. Who's too high, who's too low? Love to hear you guys' guys' thoughts and feedback, of course. But it's time to move into my player of the week and my dud of the week here for week number 1, and these were pretty easy choices for me. Player of the week is going to go to FaZe. The AD carry for Gen.G just was unbelievable. Gets that pentakill on Zeri in their first series against Fox, and then plays maybe the best series as Ezreal I've ever seen. Truly, this was not a difficult decision. FaZe was an easy choice for player of the week, but runners-up, pretty easy as well. Poor Lucid probably would have gotten player of the week in a lot of different weeks, but FaZe was transcendent. He's going to be the number 1 runner-up. Lucid was exceptional, and DK in general looked very good in week number 1. And then Ondel, again, that bot lane for KDF, really surprising. I think Ondel was more impressive to me than Leaper, just in terms of individual performances. If he can keep that up, it's something I'm going to be very excited to see moving forward. But FaZe is player of the week, and then my dud of the week is going to go to Polu, the support for OK Bro. Just not a very good week for Bro. In general, Polu looked completely outclassed, like he couldn't really play at this level. I still agree with playing him over Effort, who has shown over multiple years that he can't play at this level, but it doesn't look good right now for Bro. It certainly doesn't look good for Polu, and, you know, it's just not generally looking good for the bad teams in the LCK. So Polo is going to be my dud of the week, and FaZe is going to be my player of the week, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know down in the comments section below. Leave a like on this video if you did enjoy it. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We post about every single major region, not just the LCK, every single week on this channel. That's all 4 of the major regions, as well as the NACL weekly on this channel. So if you're interested in that comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.